Never talk to me or my son ever again. Yeah, it's Good Intentions, episode 20. Some things just go together. I mean, what kind of horrible person listens to We Will Rock You without We Are the Champions?
I've paid my dues, time after time.
Or Your Move without All Good People?
I've seen all good people turn their heads, there's no satisfied, I'm on my way.
Gin goes better with tonic, peanut butter with chocolate, Pride with Prejudice, and arguably zombies. Penn is insufferable without Teller, Ridgely forgotten without Michael. And so it is with Nintendo's first family, Donkey Kong and his son, Donkey Kong Jr. Sure, you can play one game without the other, but the two exist in a state of duality on many levels. Nintendo knows it too, which is why the two games appear so often together. They showed up in tandem as two of the launch titles for the family computer in July 1983, and they appeared together again on NES in both the US and Europe in the summer of 1986. Once Nintendo began phasing out the black box series in the US, the two games shipped as a pair on a single cartridge. And when the first game debuted on Virtual Console in 2006, the sequel followed 2 weeks later. They're quite the pair, these two. That said, while they operate best in tandem, the two games definitely feel like a Simon and Garfunkel pairing. You can enjoy the former without the latter, but the latter has a tough time standing on its own. Donkey Kong Jr. simply isn't as good a game as the classic to which it serves as a sequel, which isn't to say it's poor exactly, simply not a true great like its papa. Nevertheless, it does represent a pivotal moment in Nintendo's history as a game developer, and as such it absolutely deserves a degree of canonization. This NES adaptation of the arcade game comes pretty close to being a one-to-one conversion, and unlike the original Donkey Kong, it includes all 4 of its stages on NES. The original Donkey Kong practically spun the 2D platformer into existence out of nothing. It was one of those rare works that invented a genre, and managed to do it with style and grace. Sure, platformers have evolved considerably since Donkey Kong, as its own remake demonstrated. Where Mario moved stiffly and with stultifying limitations in the original Donkey Kong, he zipped along with a huge repertoire of skills on Game Boy. Even so, the 1981 arcade game did a bang-up job with a genre that didn't even exist prior to 1981. It controlled well, looked nice, featured memorable characters, and offered a variety of interesting challenges across 4 completely different stage layouts. That's a tall order to live up to, and Donkey Kong Jr. didn't quite. Still, if it should be regarded as something of a failure, at least it fell short while trying to aim high. The concept of a video game sequel back in 1982 basically amounted of more of the same, but with flashier graphics and/or harder gameplay. The few arcade games that had been popular enough to warrant a sequel amounted to expert play insanity that did little to change up the original work. Not Donkey Kong Jr. though. Nintendo could have made massive bank with a Donkey Kong 2 that simply dropped Mario into 4 new stages while dangling Pauline as its nubile carrot on a stick again, but rather than go that route, they essentially created an entirely new game. Donkey Kong Jr. follows in its father's proverbial footsteps by playing out as a platformer. But look past the common thread of running and jumping, and you'll find very few similarities between the two games' mechanics. Consider their respective protagonists, for starters. As a human character, Mario stood upright and moved like you'd expect a person to. He ran by swinging his arms and could leap, albeit just barely enough to clear obstacles or reach distant platforms. Donkey Kong Jr., on the other hand, has the stooped posture of a gorilla. His sprite is wider than it is tall, and between his dragging knuckles and his wide haunches, Jr.'s point of contact with the ground is much wider than Mario's. This introduces an element of ambiguity to the design of the game. Where Mario stood with a relatively wide posture, his feet placed one ahead of the other, Jr.'s stance covers about 50% more surface area than Mario's did. This difference becomes even more exaggerated when Jr. walks, as his hind legs have a huge stride and he swings his arms wide. And when Jr. leaps, he becomes about twice as wide as he is tall. All of this makes it comparatively difficult to judge Jr.'s relative position to platform edges and pits versus controlling Mario, which renders the basic platforming action of the game far trickier than it had been in the first. This sounds like an enormous design flaw, right? Well, in practice, Jr.'s ambiguous platforming controls don't have nearly as detrimental an effect on the game as you might expect. See, both Mario and Jr. assume a stance that's functionally perpendicular to the action of their respective games. Mario stood tall, vertically, and most of his challenges involved navigating horizontal spaces and obstacles. Junior stands wide, horizontally, and most of his challenges involve navigating vertically. Aside from one specific level that drops you into a series of sinuous electrical platforms, much of your time in Donkey Kong Jr. sees you actually hanging above the ground. Junior's lengthy reach and wide stance reflect a fundamental design change for this sequel. You do far less platforming and far more climbing. Junior, simian that he is, gets along far better while clambering across hanging vines and chains than he does on the ground. Mario could climb in a limited capacity using ladders to reach different levels of the construction site, but Junior thrives when he climbs. The weakest parts of Donkey Kong Jr. involve simple running and jumping, and those parts unfortunately tend to cluster at the beginning of the game, especially level 2. No doubt this was intended as a sort of segue from Donkey Kong to ease players into the sequel's new mechanics by starting them out on familiar terms, but the uneven treetops and mechanical platforms that greet you early in the game are the most challenging element of the entire thing. I suppose that means Donkey Kong Jr. fulfilled the mandate of your classic arcade game to siphon off quarters as quickly as possible, but it creates a steep barrier of entry to the action. Once you navigate those clumsy introductory platform sequences, though, the first 2 stages allow Junior to settle into his natural element and scramble across a series of vines. This is where the game actually becomes entertaining and demonstrates what makes it something besides merely Donkey Kong 2. Junior can approach climbing a few different ways. He can grasp one vine and move upwards slowly, or he can stretch between 2 vines and propel himself quickly. However, he makes his way downward far more efficiently by sliding down a single vine rather than going hand in hand down a pair of vines. This dual action creates a distinct rhythm for the vertical portions of the game, and it also introduces a certain element of risk. Do you stretch and climb quickly, turning Junior into a larger target for enemies that patrol the vines or fly overhead and drop projectiles? Or do you play it safe and stick to a single vine? You can also use Junior's ability to reach and stretch across the vines for offensive purposes. Unlike in Donkey Kong, Junior lacks a Pac-Man-style power-up. Instead, your only option for striking back at foes is to dislodge fruit which falls and takes out anything in its path. One of the game's most effective strategies is to perch on a vine next to a fruit, then reach across to knock it loose once an enemy passes below. You have a lot of freedom and options while climbing, and it's definitely the high point of the game. Unfortunately, the aforementioned third stage features very little climbing, though this is made up for by the final level, which consists of nothing but dangling chains. The fourth stage of Donkey Kong Jr. works with a principle similar to that of the final level of Donkey Kong, in that you're trying to manipulate the environment to rescue a captive. In this case, you need to slide keys up the chains to unfasten the locks pinning down Donkey Kong, who has been captured by Mario. Yes, that's right, Nintendo turned the tables here and turned their very first successful mainstream protagonist into a villain. I suppose it's a case of moral relativism. Kong kidnapped Pauline, so Mario has captured Kong to return him to the zoo, which forces Junior to step up and become the hero he was born to be, or something like that. In a sense, Junior was kind of paying for the sins of his father. Fittingly, this describes the real-world circumstances of the game's creation to a certain degree as well. By all accounts, Nintendo had never actually programmed and designed a video game from start to finish at the time of Donkey Kong's conception. That wasn't unusual. Video games were a new art back then that required fairly esoteric engineering expertise, especially in the days of dedicated arcade hardware. Like many companies dipping their toes into the waters of game development, Nintendo relied on outside contractors to help them convert game concepts into game circuitry. In the case of Donkey Kong, Nintendo used a firm called Ikegami Shusenki to produce the arcade boards. It appears the success of Donkey Kong emboldened Nintendo to bring the entire process in-house. According to a post at Game Developers Research Institute, Nintendo reversed engineered the Donkey Kong hardware and used their findings to create the Donkey Kong Jr. board themselves. So far as we can tell, that makes Donkey Kong Jr. a major milestone for the company, the first game designed and programmed internally at Nintendo. It also caused Donkey Kong Jr. to become embroiled in a lawsuit filed by Ikegami Shusenki, which claimed ownership rights to Donkey Kong's code and suggested that Nintendo had infringed on their rights. At the time, this was legally unexplored territory. No doubt Nintendo regarded the game code, which they had commissioned to be created based on their own design documents, as theirs. Courts would eventually lay down the law on code rights nearly a decade later, and once that happened, Nintendo and Ikegami Shusenki settled out of court. The details of their ultimate settlement remain a secret, but we've never seen Donkey Kong Jr.'s arcade version reproduced in any capacity, so the decision seems not to have worked out in Nintendo's favor. But that's okay, because the NES version seen here is pretty close to the arcade game. It contains all the same content, and Mode B strikes the same difficulty balance as the coin-op. It also features nearly identical graphics, though again, the change in screen orientation between arcade and home forced the NES development team to make some minor tweaks as they had in Donkey Kong. They widened some stage layouts while compressing them along the upper edge or in dead zones, and had to alter some colors. Within the active play space, however, the home port retained not only the same sprites, but also the correct general proportions of everything, such as the distance between vines and chains and platforms. So in short, this is an excellent, if not quite perfect, adaptation of the game, more faithful even than its vaunted predecessor. And like the original Donkey Kong Jr. has rarely been out of circulation for long, mainly in the 90s. But even then, 1994's Donkey Kong for Game Boy incorporated enough elements from this game that it didn't feel too far removed, spiritually speaking. Today, you can play Donkey Kong Jr. on any virtual console platform or on the NES Classic Edition mini console, assuming you can track one down. It's a meaningful little piece of Nintendo history, though far less significant in the grand scheme of things than its predecessor. And it's less fun too, but it's still pretty good. Next time on Good Nintentions, the final entry in the Famicom launch trio.